And can you tell me a bit about the backstory behind your outdoor exhibitions? Because I'd love to know how you got around to doing those.
Thank you. I've had 17 of them. The real problem with that is financing them. They were very expensive. Did Earth from the Air. I don't know if you remember that book, but it was a millennium book when the year 2000 came along, and he hired helicopters around the world and he told me something like 3 million books, which was a phenomenal achievement. And it just pictured, there were no drones. Then that's all timing, crest of the wave. Couldn't do that. You couldn't do that now. And he had a series of outdoor exhibitions, big outdoor exhibitions. There was one outside the Natural History Museum, he had one in Amsterdam. I went with the same publisher. His book, Earth from the Air, was exactly the same size as my Untamed, same picture, the same publisher, same distribution network. Everything about it was the same. And so I approached the people who organized his exhibition. So he was first, he put them alongside the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris as the first outdoor exhibition. It was such a success, he ended up having them elsewhere. So I contacted a company called We Communicate and another one called Earth Matters in Scandinavia. And then they started putting up these exhibitions and they were hugely successful, but they would have to get sponsors. You needed security at night. You needed lighting. And then they would set up a shop. So at that point, there were my books, and then I printed posters and postcards. And I think we sold about 1 million postcards. The one in Denmark broke the record for the most visitors at any photography exhibition in Denmark's history. How we did it, we went to Amsterdam, Stockholm, Stavanger. We had an exhibition in Moscow when Russia was okay to visit before all this horrible business happened. So we would set up a tent and just sell products related. So we started producing our own products. And then there'd be other things like jigsaw puzzles and so on, because ultimately you have to make a living doing this. So I had all these exhibitions, and they were a very good way of promoting the work and raised my international profile in a very positive and very effective way. And the tents were absolutely huge. And they were, I can't tell you offhand in terms of meters, but big. They were Fuji Crystal Archive chromogenic prints. They weren't inkjet, and they were mounted onto dye bond. So they were very expensively produced. As they were produced as fine art prints, that people used the same process to make high-end fine art prints. They were photographic prints, chemical prints, and then they had an ultraviolet laminate over them because they'd sometimes be 5 or 6 months out in the sun. You couldn't have them fading.
How did you get finance for those? Was it a lot of sponsorships?
Yes, sponsorship was important. And like in Russia, British Airways and the British Council were very helpful. We had the support of the various mayors' offices, and there would be some advertising associated with it. And then it was strict book sales. Of course, the organizers, they also needed to have their costs covered.
So how did you contact those organizations? Was it you emailing people, or was it someone else doing it for you and
Well, we
getting?
weren't doing many outdoor exhibitions. There were very few. They could only really do one at a time. It wasn't like a publisher publishing hundreds of books. So, yeah.
You photographed wildlife and humans extensively. How does photographing humans differ from wildlife, and which do you find more challenging and rewarding?
That's probably the most difficult question you've asked me. I think it's what I'm photographing at the time that I become totally absorbed in. So if I'm photographing people, I'm totally absorbed in it, and I'm not making a comparison. I'm the same with the wildlife. There's the total immersion. It's a strange thing. I lose all sense of time when I'm photographing, even when I was doing all these wildlife trips. Ironically, I didn't really experience much of the wildlife while I was doing it because I was totally absorbed and totally focused, no pun intended, on getting the image. And one of the trips I made to Antarctica, a friend of mine said to me, "Why don't you put your camera down for a day and just absorb the environment and just look?" Actually, I can't. Every day is expensive. I've got to make it work. But I did. I think on the last day, I didn't take a camera out. I walked around and looked. I saw more and experienced more in that day than I did in the whole rest of that trip.
Is that a thing that you've remind yourself to do to?
I do. I'm not photographing so much anymore. I'm certainly not doing the expedition trips. Those were physically grueling. And I only started those in my 40s after we shut down the photo lab. Yeah, I'm just going back into my archive and I'm re-editing things. And I'm finding new ways of doing things. I'm doing painting and I'm experimenting with collage. Photography, I love photography, but the photographic image has its challenges. David Hockney has described the photograph as a one-eyed person looking down a long tube for a split second, whereby painting you looking around. Now, that might upset a few photographers, but I think that's a very valid statement. The abstract expressionist Gerhard Richter, the German painter, artist, absolutely love his work, and he's worked with photography, and he used to paint photorealistic paintings. He feels the photograph is too flat, it isn't real, and there's more realism in a painting. So I did a little experiment the other day. I took a photograph of elephants I had, and I printed it onto this beautiful Japanese paper, and I made a few prints of paper, and I tore them, and I montaged them onto canvas. And then I painted around it with oil paint of all the real thick impasto painting with texture in it you'll never get in a photograph. And I left bits of the photograph shining through. And I felt the bits of the photograph looked too flat. So eventually I covered everything with oil paint. So now I have this oil painting with the photograph lurking behind, completely invisible. You don't see the photograph at all. And now Gerhard Richter has started off with a photograph and ended up with this abstract expressionist image. And I feel that there's a lot in paint that you still can't achieve with a photograph. And for me, the challenge, whether you want to edit some pictures into your presentation, so I can show you. So this elephant picture, now when you look at that next to the original photograph, and I've done that with other things as well. I've taken a photograph and I've tried painting it with thick paint, and there's a texture that's not in that photograph. For me, the challenge is, and I don't have an answer, I don't know if anybody's got the answer. I would love to know, how do you get the texture and the feel of expressionistic painting into a photograph? How do you lose that flatness, that smooth, totally smooth surface? How do you get Jackson Pollock into a photograph?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
My mind just goes to like somehow creating this like 3D printer that creates slight textures of the image, but that might be a long time coming for that to be created.
I don't know too much about it, but I think Factum Art in Madrid can do that. And they're a company that make the most incredible reproductions of oil paintings. And I think that they do a 3D scan for that. And then they print them flat. But these are expensive. But it just shouldn't be a random texture. It's got to leap out at you. And maybe in the way that photography terrified painters, so they went out and invented cubism and expressionism, and out of that came people like Mark Rothko. Maybe out of where photography is now, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention.